I always thought my life was a steady rhythm, a predictable melody played on the strings of routine. My name is Daniel Carter, a 42-year-old architect with a modest firm in Portland. My wife, Emily, was the harmony to my existence, or so I believed. She was 38, a freelance photographer with an eye for beauty that I'd always envied. We'd been married for 12 years, and while the early passion had softened into something quieter, I thought we were solid. Our home was a cozy two-story nestled in the suburbs, surrounded by pines and the faint hum of a life well lived. I'd built my world around her, brick by brick, trusting her implicitly. That trust began to crack on a Tuesday in late February. I'd come home early from a client meeting, my head buzzing with blueprints and deadlines. Emily wasn't there, which wasn't unusual. She often roamed the city for her shoots, but her camera bag sat untouched by the door, its leather worn from years of use. Odd, I thought. She never left without it. I texted her, a casual, "Hey, where you at?" No reply. Hours passed, and the silence gnawed at me. By 10 p.m., I was pacing, my phone clutched like a lifeline. She finally breezed in at midnight, her cheeks flushed, her hair slightly tousled. "Sorry," she said, brushing past me. "Got caught up with a client." Her voice was light, but her eyes darted away. I swallowed the unease, chalking it up to exhaustion. The next few days were a blur of normalcy, or what I convinced myself was normal. She was home more, but distant, her laughter forced. I'd catch her staring at her phone, a faint smile tugging at her lips before she'd tuck it away. I started paying attention, really paying attention. The way she'd linger in the shower, the sudden uptick in late-night shoots, the faint scent of cologne, not mine, clinging to her scarf. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself I was paranoid, that 12 years couldn't unravel so easily. But doubt is a seed, and once it's planted, it grows wild. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. She'd gone out again, claiming a gallery opening downtown. I waited 20 minutes, then grabbed my keys. I drove to the address she'd mentioned, an old warehouse turned art space. The lights were dim, the parking lot half empty. No sign of her car. My stomach twisted. I circled the block, then headed toward the riverfront, where she'd once photographed a series of bridges. That's when I saw it. Her silver Toyota parked near a sleek black Audi outside a boutique hotel. My hands trembled on the wheel. I didn't go in. Not yet. I just sat there watching as the world I'd built began to crumble. The hotel loomed like a monolith against the night sky, its windows glowing with secrets I wasn't ready to face. I parked across the street, my breath fogging the windshield. Part of me wanted to storm in, demand answers, but another part, the coward in me, held back. I waited, my mind racing through every moment of our marriage, searching for cracks I'd missed. Had she always been this restless? Had I been too blind, too comfortable to notice? The clock ticked past 1 a.m. when the glass doors slid open. Emily stepped out, her coat pulled tight, her hair catching the streetlight. Behind her was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a confidence that made my skin crawl. Ryan Matthews. I recognized him instantly. Ryan was a real estate developer, a big name in Portland's elite circles. We'd met him at a charity gala 2 years ago, where Emily had laughed at his jokes a little too loudly. I thought nothing of it then, just a charming guy working the room. Now, watching him lean close to her, his hand brushing her arm, I felt bile rise in my throat. They didn't linger. He walked her to her car, and she drove off. He climbed into the Audi and disappeared into the night. I sat there, frozen, until the cold seeped into my bones. The drive home was a haze. She was already there when I arrived, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, pretending nothing had happened. "You're late," she said, her tone casual. I mumbled something about a project, my voice hollow. That night, I lay beside her, staring at the ceiling, her breathing soft and steady while my mind screamed. I needed proof. Suspicion wasn't enough. I had to know. The next morning, I called in sick and dug through her things while she was out. Her laptop was password protected, but her old phone, tucked in a drawer, wasn't. Messages, dozens of them, From our sweet words, plans to meet, a photo of them at a vineyard last month when she told me she was visiting her sister. My hands shook as I scrolled, each word a knife. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Rage simmered beneath my skin, but I buried it, letting it fester into something sharper. I started following her, discreetly at first, tracking her car, noting her excuses. She met Ryan twice more that week, always at that hotel. I took photos, grainy shots through my windshield, building a dossier of her betrayal. But it wasn't enough to just know. I wanted her to feel the weight of it, to lose something as precious as what she'd taken from me. Revenge coiled in my chest, a living thing, whispering ideas I'd never dared entertain before. Days bled into weeks, and I became a shadow of myself, a man obsessed. Work suffered, clients complained about missed deadlines, but I didn't care. My world had narrowed to Emily and Ryan, their every move a thread I unraveled. I hired a private investigator, a grizzled guy named Paul with a smoker's cough and no questions. He delivered more than I'd bargained for. Hotel receipts, security footage, even a recording of them laughing in a cafe, her hand on his knee. The evidence piled up, a grotesque monument to her lies. But it wasn't just about her anymore. Ryan's smug face haunted me. His wealth, his charm, his audacity to take what was mine. I started digging into him. Ryan Matthews wasn't just a developer. He was a predator. Lawsuits hushed up, whispers of coercion, a trail of broken partnerships. He thrived on control, and Emily was his latest conquest. I wondered if she knew, if she cared. Did she think he'd leave his wife, a icy blonde named Claire, for her? I met Claire once at that same gala. She'd seemed untouchable, a queen in her own right. Now I saw her as an ally, a weapon I could wield. But first, I needed to understand Emily's endgame. Was this a fling, or had she already checked out of our life? One night, I tested her. "Let's take a trip," I said over dinner, watching her face. "Just us, somewhere quiet." She hesitated, her fork pausing mid-air. "I've got shoots lined up," she replied, too quickly. "Maybe next month." I nodded, swallowing the lie. Later, I found a receipt in her coat pocket, lingerie, expensive, not my size. The next day, I followed her again. Same hotel, same routine. But this time, I didn't just watch. I slipped into the lobby after they'd gone upstairs, bribed a bellhop for their room number. For 112. I stood outside that door, hearing muffled voices, laughter, the creak of a bed. My fists clenched, but I walked away. Not yet. Back home, I pored over Paul's reports. Ryan's life was a house of cards, over-leveraged investments, shady deals, a marriage held together by appearances. Emily was a pawn, but she didn't know it. I could destroy them both, but it had to be precise, devastating. I started sketching a plan, not on paper but in my mind, a blueprint for ruin. Emily's photography career, Ryan's empire, their reputations, I'd burn it all down. And they'd never see it coming. The first step was Claire. If Ryan had a weakness, it was his wife. She controlled half his assets, a prenup ironclad enough to cripple him if she walked. I found her at a fundraiser, her silver gown catching the light like armor. I approached, heart pounding, and introduced myself as an old friend of Emily's. Claire's eyes narrowed, but she played along, her smile sharp. "How's your wife?" she asked, sipping champagne. I leaned in, voice low. "She's been busy with Ryan." The flicker in her expression told me she suspected something. I didn't push, just planted the seed and left her my card. She called 2 days later. We met at a diner far from prying eyes. Claire was all business, her manicured nails tapping the table. "What do you know?" she demanded. I showed her the photos, the receipts, the timeline. Her face hardened, but she didn't flinch. "He's done this before," she said, almost to herself. "But not with someone I can touch." We struck a deal. She'd help me dismantle Ryan, and I'd handle Emily. She had resources, lawyers, contacts, a ruthless streak I admired. I had rage, and that was enough. Meanwhile, Emily grew bolder. She stopped hiding her late nights, tossing excuses like crumbs. I played the oblivious husband, nodding along, while my plan took shape. I contacted a journalist, a hungry young woman named Lena who'd been sniffing around Ryan's dealings for months. I fed her scraps, anonymously at first, about his finances, his habits. Then I turned to Emily's world. Her photography wasn't just a hobby. It was her identity. I knew her clients, her galleries, her fragile network of trust. I started whispering to them, subtle doubts about her reliability, her personal issues. A canceled shoot here, a missed deadline there, her reputation began to fray. At home, I kept up the charade. I cooked her favorite meals, asked about her day, watched her lie through her teeth. One night, she came home reeking of Ryan's cologne, and I almost snapped. Instead, I smiled, poured her wine, and imagined the reckoning. Claire was moving fast. Divorce papers were being drafted, assets frozen. Ryan wouldn't know what hit him, but Emily's fall would be slower, more personal. I wanted her to feel every cut. By mid-March, the gears were turning. Claire's lawyers struck first, serving Ryan papers at his office in front of his staff. Paul tipped me off. Ryan stormed out, red-faced, barking into his phone. Claire didn't stop there. She leaked his financial troubles to Lena, who ran a scathing exposé. Portland tycoon's empire built on sand. Investors pulled out, projects stalled. Ryan's world was imploding, and Emily was caught in the blast radius. She came home that night, pale, distracted. "Rough day?" I asked, feigning concern. "You could say that," she muttered, avoiding my eyes. I ramped up my own campaign. I hacked her email. Years of shared passwords made it easy, and found her bookings drying up. Clients were ghosting her, galleries postponing her shows. I'd spread just enough doubt to make her untouchable. She started pacing the house, snapping at me over nothing. "What's wrong?" I'd ask, all innocence. "Everything," she'd say, and I'd nod, hiding my satisfaction. She didn't suspect me, not yet. She thought it was bad luck, or Ryan's mess spilling over. Then came the call that broke her. A gallery owner, one of her biggest supporters, dropped her from an upcoming exhibit. "I heard some things," he said. I'd made sure of it. She slammed the phone down, tears streaking her face. I watched from the kitchen, sipping coffee, as she unraveled. "I don't understand," she whispered. I wanted to scream, "You brought this on yourself," but I held back. The real blow was still coming. That weekend, I staged the final act of her humiliation. I invited her oldest friend, Sarah, over for dinner, someone Emily trusted implicitly. Sarah didn't know the full story, but I'd fed her enough hints to make her wary. Over wine, I let Emily ramble about her stress, then casually dropped, "You've been spending a lot of time with Ryan lately, huh?" The room went still. Sarah's eyes widened. Emily stammered, "It's just work." Sarah didn't buy it. I'd planted too many seeds. She left early, and Emily turned on me, furious. "What the hell was that?" she demanded. I shrugged. "Just making conversation." That night, she slept on the couch. I stood over her, watching her chest rise and fall, and felt nothing but cold resolve. Ryan was ruined, Claire was free, and Emily was teetering on the edge. But I wasn't done. The cruelest part, the part that would shatter her completely, was still to come, and I'd savor every second of it. The air in our house grew thick with tension, a storm brewing beneath the surface of every glance, every word. Emily's unraveling was palpable. She barely ate. Her phone sat silent, her once vibrant energy replaced by a hollow shell. I watched her crumble, a silent architect of her despair, and felt a twisted satisfaction. She still didn't suspect me. She thought her world was collapsing by chance, a cruel twist of fate. But I was the hand turning the screws, and I wasn't finished. Ryan's downfall was accelerating. Claire's legal assault had stripped him of his penthouse, his cars, his veneer of invincibility. The papers called him a fraud, a has-been. I wondered if Emily still saw him as her knight, or if she'd begun to see the tarnish. I decided to test her loyalty, not to me but to him. One evening, as she stared blankly at a cold cup of tea, I said, "Heard Ryan's in deep trouble." Must be tough for his friends. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with panic before she masked it. I wouldn't know, she mumbled, but her voice trembled. I pressed further. Saw his Audi towed yesterday. Guess he's not untouchable after all. She flinched, her fingers tightening around the mug. I left it there, letting the barb sink in. That night, she slipped out, probably to call him, to cling to whatever thread remained. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. Paul had tapped her phone weeks ago, and the transcripts were gold. The messages painted a desperate picture. Ryan begging her to meet, promising they'd figure it out. Emily's replies were frantic, laced with fear. She was losing everything, and he was too broken to save her. I savored each line, imagining her pacing that hotel room, her illusions shattering. But I wasn't content with her quiet suffering. I wanted her exposed, raw, stripped of every refuge. So I turned to her family. Her parents lived an hour away, a sweet retired couple who adored her. I'd always been the dutiful son-in-law, and they trusted me. I drove out there on a Saturday claiming concern. She's been distant, I said, voice heavy with feigned worry. I think she's in over her head with someone. I didn't name Ryan. Just let their imaginations fill the gaps. Her mother's face fell. Her father's jaw tightened. They'd call her, I knew, and she'd have no answers to give. Back home, Emily was a ghost. She barely spoke, her eyes red-rimmed. The call from her parents came that night. I heard her voice break through the wall as she tried to explain. It's not what you think, she pleaded, but the damage was done. Her support system was cracking, and I was the chisel. I poured myself a whiskey, listening to her sob, and felt the first stirrings of something darker. A need to push her further, to see how far she'd fall before she broke completely. The next phase was public. Emily's career was already teetering, but I wanted it obliterated. She'd built her name on authenticity, on capturing raw moments, ironic, given the lies she lived. I contacted Lena again, the journalist, and fed her a new angle. Emily's collaboration with Ryan, a disgraced tycoon. I didn't need to invent much, just twisted the truth enough to make it salacious. She's been his muse, I wrote anonymously, attaching a blurry photo of them outside the hotel. Lena ran with it, publishing a piece titled Photographer's Fall, tied to Matthew's ruin. It hit online Monday morning, and by noon, Emily's phone was buzzing with notifications she couldn't ignore. I was at the kitchen table, pretending to work, when she stormed in, her face ashen. Have you seen this? She demanded, thrusting her phone at me. The headline glared back. I feigned shock. That's insane. How'd they even get that idea? She paced, muttering about libel, about calling her lawyer. But the damage was spreading. Her Instagram flooded with comments, clients canceling outright. One gallery owner emailed her, Kurt, we can't associate with this mess. She sank onto the couch, head in her hands, and I watched, silent, as her identity dissolved. That night, she tried to reach Ryan. I'd seen the pattern. When she was cornered, she ran to him. But Paul's latest report showed his phone was disconnected, his accounts frozen. He was a sinking ship, and she was tethered to it. I let her stew, her desperation mounting, until she finally snapped. I need to get out of here, she said, grabbing her keys. Where? I asked, calm as stone. She hesitated, then mumbled, a friend's. I didn't stop her. I knew she'd find no solace. Her friends were pulling away, poisoned by my whispers and the article's fallout. She returned hours later, defeated, and I greeted her with a smile that hid the storm inside me. I escalated the next day. I sent an anonymous tip to a local art blog, claiming Emily had fabricated her portfolio, staged her shots. It was a lie, but it didn't matter, mud sticks. The blog ran it, and her remaining supporters turned skeptical. She spent hours on the phone, begging, explaining, but the tide had turned. I overheard her with Sarah, her voice cracking, I don't know who's doing this. I almost laughed. She still didn't see me, the husband she'd dismissed, as the architect of her ruin. With her career in ashes, I turned to her pride. Emily had always been vain about her appearance, her charm. She wielded it like a tool. I decided to take that too. Claire, my unlikely partner, had a flair for the dramatic. She suggested a party, a celebration of her divorce, and insisted I bring Emily. "Let her see what she's lost," Claire said, her voice cold. I agreed. I told Emily it was a networking event, a chance to salvage her reputation. She resisted, but I pushed. "You can't hide forever," I said, and she relented, her vanity overriding her dread. The night arrived, a glittering affair at Claire's mansion. Emily wore a black dress, her attempt at defiance, but her eyes were dull, her confidence fractured. Claire played her role perfectly, greeting us with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, then parading Ryan's downfall like a trophy. "He's living in a motel now," she announced to the crowd, her gaze flicking to Emily. Whispers rippled through the room. Emily froze, her glass trembling. Then Claire dropped the bomb. "And his little side projects? They're crashing too." She didn't name Emily, but the implication was clear. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. Emily's face burned red, and I stood beside her, the picture of a supportive husband, while inside I reveled in her shame. She fled to the bathroom and I followed, lingering outside. I heard her retching, then sobbing, the sound raw and broken. When she emerged, mascara streaked, I offered a handkerchief. "Rough night," I said, neutral. She nodded, mute, and I drove her home in silence. The party had done its work. Her social circle, already fraying, was now a graveyard. She'd been publicly tied to Ryan's disgrace, her allure tarnished beyond repair. I'd stripped her of her armor, and she didn't even know I'd swung the blade. The next morning, she barely left her room. I brought her coffee, playing the doting spouse, and watched her sip it with shaking hands. "Maybe a break would help," I suggested. She didn't respond, just stared at the wall. I left her there, a prisoner in her own mind, and began the next phase. Her isolation was nearly complete, but I wanted her to feel it in her bones. Every friend lost, every door closed, every mirror reflecting a stranger. Emily's collapse was accelerating, a house of cards folding under its own weight. She stopped leaving the house, her camera gathering dust. The phone calls dwindled, her parents distant, her friends gone, her clients a memory. I kept the pressure subtle but relentless. I'd accidentally leave articles about Ryan's latest setbacks on the counter, watch her flinch as she read them. I'd mention old acquaintances in passing. "Saw Sarah downtown. She looked busy," knowing Emily couldn't reach out. Her world was shrinking, and I was the unseen hand drawing the walls closer. One afternoon, I took it further. I invited her sister, Laura, over under the guise of a family catch-up. Laura was blunt, protective, the kind of woman who'd see through Emily's excuses. I'd primed her with vague concerns weeks ago, and she arrived wary. Over lunch, I steered the conversation to Emily's stress. Laura pounced. "What's really going on, Em? You look like hell." Emily tried to deflect, but Laura pressed, and I sat back, letting the trap close. "Is it that Matthews guy?" Laura asked, her tone sharp. Emily's fork clattered to the plate. "It's nothing," she whispered, but Laura wasn't buying it. The air grew heavy, and Laura left with a curt goodbye, her disappointment palpable. Emily turned to me, eyes blazing. "Why'd you let her do that?" I shrugged. "She's worried. We all are." That night, she broke. I found her in the living room, a bottle of wine half empty, tears streaming. "I've lost everything," she slurred. "My work, my friends, everything." I sat beside her, voice soft. "You'll get through it." But I knew she wouldn't, not the way she hoped. I'd orchestrated this moment, her lowest point, and it was almost time for the final blow. Ryan was a shell, Claire was thriving, and Emily was a wreck. But I wanted her to see it all, to face the wreckage she'd invited. I contacted Paul one last time. "Find Ryan," I said. "I need to know where he is." Paul tracked him to a dingy apartment on the edge of town, a far cry from his old life. I planned the confrontation, not for me but for her. She'd see him, see what she'd chased, and I'd make sure it crushed her. The cruelty wasn't in the act itself, but in the mirror it held up to her choices. The setup was meticulous. I told Emily I'd booked us a weekend getaway, a chance to reconnect. She was reluctant, her spirit battered, but I insisted, painting it as a lifeline. "We need this," I said, and she nodded, too tired to argue. I drove us out of Portland, past the city's glow, to a rundown neighborhood she didn't recognize. "Shortcut?" I lied, pulling up outside Ryan's new address. A sagging building with peeling paint. She frowned, confused, until he stepped out, unshaven, in a wrinkled shirt, hauling trash to the curb. Her breath caught, her hand flying to the window. "Who's that?" I asked, feigning ignorance. She didn't answer, just stared as Ryan shuffled back inside. A broken man. I let the silence stretch, then said, "Looks familiar. Friend of yours." Her face crumpled, a mix of shame and recognition. She knew I knew, maybe not the full extent, but enough. I drove on, the car heavy with her silence, and checked us into a cheap motel nearby. "Thought we'd keep it simple," I said, watching her shrink into herself. That night, she barely slept, her back to me, while I lay awake, plotting the final reveal. The next morning, I handed her an envelope. "Found this in your old coat," I said casual. Inside were printouts, her messages to Ryan, the photo from the vineyard, a hotel receipt. Her hands shook as she opened it, her eyes scanning the evidence. "Daniel," she started, voice cracking. I cut her off. "Don't. Just read." She did, tears spilling, and when she looked up, I saw fear. Not regret, not yet, just fear of what I'd do. I stood, towering over her. "You built this," I said, low and steady. "Now live in it." I left her there, stranded in that motel room with her sins, and drove home alone. She'd find her way back eventually. I hadn't taken her keys, but the journey would be hers to suffer. I dismantled her life piece by piece, and this was the crescendo. Her facing the man she'd betrayed me for, then facing me, knowing I'd seen it all. The revenge wasn't loud or violent. It was surgical, a quiet annihilation of everything she'd held dear. And I wasn't done watching her burn. The drive back to Portland was a quiet triumph. The hum of the engine, a steady pulse beneath my thoughts. Emily was miles behind me, marooned in that drab motel with the weight of her choices. I didn't feel joy, not exactly, but a grim satisfaction settled in my chest, a craftsman admiring a finished structure. She'd call soon, I knew, scrambling for explanations, for forgiveness. I wouldn't answer, not yet. The silence was part of the punishment, a void she'd have to navigate alone. My phone stayed dark as I pulled into our driveway, the house looming like a hollow shell. It wasn't home anymore, just a stage for the final act. Inside, I poured a whiskey and sat in the dim living room, replaying the moment her face had fallen at the sight of Ryan. That image, her lover reduced to a shadow, her illusions shattered, was worth every sleepless night, every calculated move. But the game wasn't over. I'd stripped her of her career, her friends, her family's trust, her pride. Now I'd take the last thing she had left, her sense of self. I'd make her see the wreckage not just as consequence, but as a reflection of who she'd become. The envelope had been the spark. The fire was still to come. She stumbled in at dawn, her eyes swollen, her coat damp from the early mist. She'd taken a bus, I guessed, no one left to call for a ride. "Daniel," she rasped, voice raw. I didn't look up from my glass. "We need to talk," she said, stepping closer. I let the silence stretch, then stood, towering over her. "You don't get to decide that anymore," I said, my tone ice. She flinched, but I didn't soften. "You've got nothing I want to hear." She sank onto the couch, head in her hands, and I left her there, a crumpled figure in the wreckage of her making. Later, I sorted through her things, not to pack them, but to dismantle her further. I found her journals, pages of dreams and doubts, and left them open on the table, her private thoughts exposed. I moved her camera to the garage, her tools of identity relegated to storage. Every small act was a cut, a reminder of what she'd lost. She watched me from the doorway, silent, her defiance gone. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. I didn't answer, just kept working, letting her question echo unanswered. The days that followed were a slow bleed. Emily drifted through the house like a ghost, her presence a shadow of the woman I'd married. She tried to reach out, tentative apologies, pleas for a conversation, but I shut her down, my silence a wall she couldn't breach. I wanted her to feel the isolation, to taste the loneliness she'd forced on me with every clandestine meeting. The phone rang once, her mother I assumed, but she didn't pick up. Her world had shrunk to these walls, and I was the gatekeeper, holding the keys she'd never earn back. I escalated the pressure. I invited Claire over, ostensibly to discuss a project. She arrived in a tailored suit, her presence commanding, and Emily shrank as Claire filled the room with talk of Ryan's latest humiliation. Evicted from his apartment, scrambling for loans. "He's a cautionary tale now," Claire said, her eyes flicking to Emily with a knowing glint. I nodded, playing along, while Emily stared at her hands, her shame a tangible thing. Claire left with a smirk, and I turned to Emily. "She's doing well," I said casual. "Some people land on their feet." The barb hit, her shoulders slumped further. That night I staged a memory. I pulled out our old photo albums, vacations, anniversaries, moments she'd once cherished, and spread them across the table. "Remember this?" I asked, pointing to a shot of us laughing on a beach. She nodded, tears welling. "What happened to us?" she murmured. I leaned in, voice low. "You happened. You chose him." She recoiled, the truth a slap she couldn't dodge. I left the albums there, a gallery of what she'd thrown away, and went to bed, leaving her to drown in the past. Her desperation grew. She started cleaning, cooking, trying to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, but I ignored it, letting her efforts rot in the air. I wanted her to see the futility, to understand that no amount of penance could rebuild what she'd raised. The revenge wasn't in the grand gestures anymore. It was in the quiet, relentless erosion of her hope, her belief that she could fix this. She was a stranger in her own life, and I was the mirror showing her the truth. A week later, Ryan resurfaced. Not in person, but in a text to Emily's phone, which I'd left on the counter. "I need you." It read, simple and pathetic. She saw it before I could delete it, her eyes lighting with a flicker of something. Hope, maybe, or delusion. "He's nothing now," I said, snatching the phone. "You still think he's worth it?" She didn't answer, just stared at the screen as I tossed it aside. But the seed was planted, and I let it grow. I knew she'd try to reach him, to cling to the last shred of her fantasy. I waited, patient, until she slipped out one evening, her steps hesitant. Paul had warned me. Ryan was squatting in a friend's basement, a far cry from his old penthouse. I didn't follow her this time. I didn't need to. She'd see him, see the squalor, and come back broken anew. She returned at midnight, her face a mask of despair. "How was your night?" I asked, sipping coffee. She didn't respond, just climbed the stairs, her silence an admission. I smiled into the dark. She'd chased a ghost and found a corpse. Her dream of Ryan as savior was dead, and I'd orchestrated the funeral. The next morning, I pushed harder. I called a locksmith, had the bedroom lock changed while she was in the shower. When she emerged, I handed her a sleeping bag. "You're on the couch now," I said flat. "This is my space." Her eyes widened, but she didn't fight, just took the bag and shuffled downstairs. It was petty, yes, but it was power, a reminder that she'd lost control of even the smallest corners of her life. She slept there that night, a guest in her own home, while I stretched out in the bed we'd shared, the emptiness beside me a victory. Her unraveling was complete, or so I thought. But Emily had one last card, a plea for mercy I hadn't anticipated. She cornered me in the kitchen, her voice shaking. "I'll leave. I'll go anywhere. Just stop this." I looked at her, saw the defeat, and felt a pang, brief, fleeting, of something like pity. But it passed. "You don't get to walk away clean," I said. You stay, and you live with it. She nodded, resigned, and I knew I'd won. The house became a prison, its walls echoing with her defeat. Emily stopped fighting, stopped trying to mend what couldn't be fixed. She moved through the days in a daze, cooking meals I didn't eat, cleaning rooms I didn't use. I let her, watching her fade, her identity a husk I'd hollowed out. But I wasn't satisfied, not fully. The revenge had been cruel, precise, but it lacked a final note, a crescendo to seal her fate. I wanted her to see it all, to stand in the ruins and know I'd built them. I planned a reveal. I gathered everything, Paul's reports, the photos, the articles, the messages, and laid them out on the dining table like a grotesque exhibit. When she came downstairs, I gestured to it. "This is us," I said, voice steady. "This is what you did." She approached, hesitant, and leafed through the pile, her hands trembling. The scope of it hit her, the months of planning, the breadth of my reach. "You?" she whispered, incredulous. I nodded. "Me." Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, surrounded by the evidence of her betrayal and my retribution. I didn't comfort her. I stood there, letting her process, letting the weight crush her. "You could have just left," she said, voice small. "I did," I replied. "The day I found out. This is what's left." She cried then, a raw, guttural sound, and I felt nothing. No triumph, no remorse, just a cold clarity. She'd see this moment every day, every time she looked at me, at herself. I'd taken everything, and now I'd taken her ability to forget. That night I packed a bag, not to leave but to show her I could. "I'm staying at a hotel," I said. "You figure out what's next." She didn't protest, just nodded, her eyes dull. I drove off, leaving her in that house of ghosts, the architect of her ruin stepping out of the frame. But I'd be back. This wasn't the end, just a pause before the final reckoning. The hotel was sterile, a blank slate where I could think. I didn't sleep much. My mind churned with what I'd done, what I'd become. Emily was broken, a shell of the woman I'd loved, and I'd forged the hammer. Part of me wondered if I'd gone too far, if the man staring back in the mirror was a stranger. But then I'd see her with Ryan, hear her lies, and the doubt burned away. She'd chosen this path. I'd just paved it with thorns. The question now was what came next, how to end it, how to walk away from the rubble. I stayed away 3 days, letting her stew in the silence. When I returned, the house was eerily still. She sat at the table, the evidence still spread out, untouched. She didn't look up as I entered. "I'm done," she said, voice flat. "I'll go." I nodded, expecting it, but added, "You'll leave with nothing. No car, no money, just what you can carry." Her eyes flickered, the last spark of defiance, but it died fast. She packed a suitcase, clothes, a few photos, nothing of value, and walked out, the door clicking shut behind her. I watched from the window as she trudged down the street, a solitary figure in the gray dawn. She had no one left to turn to. Ryan was a wreck, her family distant, her friends gone. I'd ensured that. The cruelty wasn't in her leaving. It was in knowing she'd carry this with her, a scar no time could heal. I sold the house a month later, moved to a new city, started over. Emily faded into rumor. Someone said she'd left Portland. Another claimed she was waitressing downtown. I didn't care to verify. Looking back, the revenge was a masterpiece, a symphony of pain I'd conducted with precision. It didn't heal me, didn't fill the void she'd left, but it balanced the scales. She'd betrayed me with a real person, a tangible theft, and I'd repaid it with a devastation so complete she'd never recover. The architect in me admired the structure. The man in me wondered what it had cost. But I'd never know, and I didn't need to. It was finished.